A relaxing afternoon by a lake, the sound of children nearby, a husband crafting toys from alligator teeth. Suddenly, strange figures appear, armed near naked, mounted on mules. Sarah's warning is dismissed, but seconds later, death erupts. Her husband is brutally killed, her children terrified, and she's thrust into a horrifying captivity. This wasn't just an attack. It was the start of a descent into a living hell few could imagine, let alone survive. Sarah Newton entered the world in Huntingdon, England, approximately 60 miles north of London, the last of 10 children born to parents described as poor but pious. Her father died when she was 3 years old, leaving her mother widowed with a large family. Under the guidance of her mother and eldest brother, Sarah and her siblings were raised with a focus on habits of industry and strong religious principles, achieving a respectable maturity despite their circumstances. On October 14, 1827, at the age of 18, Sarah Newton married John Horne at St. James Church, Clerkenwell, London. The couple established their residence at No. 2 Moon Street, Gilham Square, in Islington, London. John Horne operated a small mercantile business. Sarah described this period living with her husband and mother as the first and happiest part of her married life. Her mother resided with them until her death, occurring on her 66th birthday, about 3 years after Sarah's marriage. At the time of her mother's passing, Sarah had 2 young sons. John, who was 15 months older than his brother Joseph, then aged 16 months. Around 1833, the prospect of emigrating to America gained considerable public attention as a means to improve one's condition in life. John Horne became convinced and decided their family should immigrate. His initial plan involved traveling ahead alone to secure a home before sending for his wife and children. However, Sarah opposed being left behind, citing both her deep attachment to her husband and concerns about her health. It was suggested that a sea voyage might prove beneficial. Consequently, they resolved to make the journey together, bidding farewell to friends and family in England to seek a new life across the Atlantic. After settling their affairs, the Horne family, including young John and Joseph, departed from England on July 20, 1833. They sailed aboard the ship Samuel Robinson under Captain Kissal, bound for New York. The voyage was described as pleasant, and they arrived at their destination on August 27, 1833. Upon arrival, Sarah's health showed noticeable improvement. In New York City, the family took up residence at 237 Madison Street. John Horne secured employment as a clerk in a mercantile house owned by a Mr. John McKen. They remained in New York, allowing John time to assess the situation and determine their next steps toward establishing a permanent home in America, staying there until November 1834. This period in New York served as an intermediate stage before the family embarked on the next far more perilous leg of their journey toward the newly forming Republic of Texas. Around November 1834, while the Horne family resided at 237 Madison Street in New York City, considerable discussion arose regarding the newly formed Republic of Texas. Information circulated through newspapers and conversations, highlighting opportunities and offering significant incentives to attract settlers to this vast territory. A key figure promoting colonization efforts was Dr. Beals, a New York physician actively involved in organizing a settlement venture destined for the Rio Grande region. Dr. Beals's interest stemmed from a need to secure title to a large land grant. The terms apparently stipulated that settlement must occur by a certain date, otherwise the land would revert to the government. As a powerful lure for potential emigrant settlers joining Beals' colony were promised 137 acres of land, each along with a town lot upon which to construct a dwelling. Promotional materials emphasized that the colony was to be established directly on the Rio Grande, described unequivocally as the extreme point of safety from the Indians in that area. Despite these assurances and the potential for a better life that drew her husband, Sarah Horne, found herself plagued by persistent unease from the very first mention of Texas. She later recorded that despite summoning all her fortitude, her mind was a constant prey to the most distressing apprehensions, tormented by an undefinable sense of affliction that seemed to perpetually haunt my imagination. Witnessing her distress, John Horn, whom she described as kind, offered a considerate alternative. He proposed securing her passage back to England to stay with friends while he proceeded alone to establish a permanent home, promising to return for her later. Sarah, however, felt unable to accept this separation, viewing her husband as her greatest earthly treasure. She felt a profound conviction that if dangers lay in his path, it was her duty, aligned with the feelings of the heart I had given him with my hands, to share those perils with him. Consequently, with John's agreement, she solidified her resolve to accompany the family on the uncertain journey ahead. Adding a layer of psychological weight to their impending departure was a remarkably vivid and recurring dream Sarah experienced just before leaving New York. On 3 out of 4 consecutive nights, she dreamt she was overcome with distress while caring for 2 infant children. These infants, entrusted to her protection through unknown means, were not recognizable as her own. Yet she perceived them as exceptionally beautiful. Their care caused her immense, painful anxiety in the dream, compounded by her inability to find anyone willing to assist. At length she dreamt she saw 2 of her sisters, Mary and Eliza, calling upon Eliza for help with the infants. Sarah found her sister seemingly ignored. Her plea turned away and declared the children were Sarah's own responsibility. She then appealed to her sister Mary, only to receive the identical response. Looking around in the dream, Sarah discovered a small bed in a corner. She laid one of the infants upon it, struck by its appearance as the most beautiful creature I had ever beheld. She then picked up the other infant and began nursing it at her right breast. While this child was still nursing, she went back to the bed to check on the first infant. Its beauty, however, had vanished. It now appeared naked and extremely filthy, resembling a body that had been dead for some time. Meanwhile, the second infant continued nursing at her right breast, but simultaneously milk began flowing from her left breast with such overwhelming abundance that it induced a dreadful chill throughout her entire frame, causing her to awaken abruptly. The repetition of such a detailed and specific dream over multiple nights struck Sarah as profoundly singular, intensifying her underlying apprehension. Further fueling her sense of unease were tangible events that occurred as they finalized their departure from the city. Incidents Sarah viewed as aligning ominously with her internal foreboding about Texas. The first wagon dispatched to the battery carrying a load of their furniture for shipment encountered misfortune when the horse inexplicably took fright. It bolted running furiously, resulting in considerable damage to the goods and injuring itself. The horse's owner reportedly could not account for this behavior, finding it highly unusual for the animal. The following day, as a second load was sent, a tremendous fall of rain began, accompanied by terrible thunder and lightning. Amidst the storm, the horse pulling this second load broke through the wooden dock, noted as the first such occurrence there, and was extricated only with significant difficulty, sustaining bad injuries in the process. During these events, Sarah also lost a favorable article of furniture. Having concluded their preparations, the Horn family embarked on their sea journey towards the Land of Promise on November 11, 1834. They sailed from New York aboard the schooner Amos Wright under the command of Captain Monroe. The voyage was anticipated to take between 20 and 30 days based on information they had received. However, the actual passage lasted approximately 5 weeks before they finally reached the Texas port of Copano. Their arrival at Copano marked the end of the sea voyage, but initiated a new phase of challenging travel. They were informed that their ultimate destination lay roughly 2.5 months' journey further inland. A significant logistical hurdle immediately presented itself: the necessity of procuring ox teams to haul their wagons and belongings. These essential draft animals had to be obtained from a location 50 miles distant. The time consumed by securing the teams and making other necessary preparations extended from approximately December 16, 1834, until the first day of January 1835. During this waiting period, the sizable company of emigrants, including the Horns, resided in tents pitched near the coast. They managed to fare reasonably well, subsisting on the abundant game and fish available from the local environment. This interval, though delaying their progress, allowed the party to gather resources and organize for the demanding overland expedition that lay before them. On January 1st, 1835, with all preparations complete, the company commenced its overland journey toward the Rio Grande. It was a large and diverse group composed of individuals from different parts of the world, all ostensibly heading for Dr. Beals's colony. The difficulties began almost immediately. Within the first mile of travel, the wagon assigned to Sarah Horn and her children broke down. She was transferred to a second wagon, but only a few yards further on, this wagon also failed beneath her. Moved subsequently into a pleasure carriage, this vehicle too suffered a breakdown shortly thereafter, rendering it unusable. Experiencing 3 separate vehicle failures within such a short distance led others in the company to refer to her pointedly as the unlucky woman. Progress was slow and laborious. The first day's travel covered only about 2 miles. For half this distance, Sarah rode on horseback, while 2 gentlemen carried her children, as John Horn needed to remain with the wagons. Reaching this point was necessary simply to obtain wood and water. The entirety of the next day and part of the day following was consumed by repairing the damaged wagons. In the latter part of that third day, they managed to travel approximately 3 miles further, crossing the Nueces River before making camp for the night. The subsequent day saw them cover another 6 miles, bringing the company to a settlement known as Austin's Colony here. The entire group encamped for 2 days. Sarah described this place as very unhealthy, predominantly settled by Irish immigrants, among whom significant numbers had died from ague and fever. The residents attempted to dissuade the company from proceeding further into the interior, urging them to settle there instead. Their warnings were stark, alleging that if the travelers continued onward, the Indians would kill and eat us. An incident during their 2-day stay underscored the anxieties of the journey. On the afternoon of their arrival at Austin's Colony, 4 men from the company went out to hunt. When they failed to return by dark, considerable alarm spread through the camp. Fires were kept burning throughout the night, and a large bell was procured, hung upon a tree, and rung continuously to guide the missing men. Fortunately, the next morning all 4 hunters returned safely, having simply lost their way. Departing Austin's Colony, the company traveled slowly onward. After covering approximately 40 miles, they reached another settlement named La Haddad. This place was described as being composed solely of Spanish-speaking people who, according to Sarah, had never seen an English woman before. The arrival of the Horns and any other Anglo women in the party naturally excited great curiosity, drawing crowds who flocked to gaze at them. Like the settlers at Austin's Colony, the inhabitants of La Haddad also cautioned the company against venturing deeper into the interior, specifically warning them about the danger posed by Native Americans. They conveyed that various Native American parties were constantly on the watch to surprise and take the unwary traveler. From La Haddad, the group proceeded to Bahia, present-day Goliad. Their journey necessitated a longer stop here, lasting approximately 2 weeks. The reason for the delay was the condition of their ox teams, which were significantly worn down by the travel endured thus far, compelling the company to procure fresh teams. At Bahia, the emigrants again encountered a local population seemingly unfamiliar with English females. Sarah noted that they were a new thing under the sun to the residents who had never having seen any English females before. The locals were permitted to indulge their curiosity, observing the newcomers from 6 Hazurn in the morning until 6 Hazurn in the evening. However, they were required to retire after that hour, apparently due to concerns among the travelers about the local populace's perceived propensity to plunder. Reflecting the general tension and perceived dangers of the region, Sarah remarked that strict watch had to be kept every night, guarding against potential threats not only from Indians, but also from the local Spaniards, whom the travelers regarded as very little better. After securing new teams and departing Bahia, the company crossed the San Antonio River and headed towards San Antonio de Bichar. About 5 miles outside of San Antonio, they came upon a grim scene. the spot where a Mr. Smith, described as a gentleman from the United States, had recently been attacked by a party of Native Americans. He was found lying by the roadside, weltering in his blood. The account details that one of his 3 Spanish guides had been killed during the encounter, while the other 2 were so badly wounded they could barely manage to reach San Antonio and report the melancholy affair. Fortuitously, Dr. Beals, the promoter of the colony they were heading towards, was traveling with their company and was able to provide immediate medical assistance to the wounded Mr. Smith. Although severely exhausted from the prolonged struggle, which Smith later recounted, lasted about 3 hours against vastly superior numbers of Indians and suffering from significant blood loss. Smith was still conscious and able to converse. Dr. Beals extracted a number of balls and slugs from Smith's body, dressed his wounds, and arranged for him to be transported to San Antonio. Sarah later learned that Mr. Smith subsequently died there from his injuries. Witnessing this horrible scene, Sarah felt it but too well accorded with the forebodings of my heart. The sight intensified her feelings of dread, making her feel as though she was hastening onward, if not to death itself, to some indefinite scene of misery, the anticipation of which felt almost as unbearable as the potential reality. She looked upon her husband and young children with emotions only an anxious mother's heart can fully realize. Continuing their journey, the company traveled approximately 30 miles beyond San Antonio, reaching Presidio del Rio Grande. They remained at this location for several days. Sarah noted that the Spanish residents here were very kind to them. During their stay, some of the young men in the company engaged in fishing along the banks of the Rio Grande. While doing so, they discovered and killed a large female bear. The bear was described as very fat, despite having 3 young cubs with her. The men captured the cubs and attempted to tame them. Sarah took the opportunity to preserve some of the bear's oil, storing it in small empty bottles she carried with her. Upon reaching the vicinity of their expected destination near the Rio Grande, the colonists encountered an unexpected and unwelcome development. Sarah Horn recorded that, by some means, the place of our location was changed, forcing them to proceed an additional 30 miles deeper into territory described as a wilderness infested with savages. This deviation from the original plan significantly increased their exposure to potential conflict. The colonists later learned, or at least came to believe, based on information from unnamed gentlemen, that this cruel disappointment, being denied their location as promised and instead led further into a dangerous area, was a calculated move. The suspected motive was to induce a more speedy settlements and increase the price of the land, a stark contrast to the assurances of safety previously given. This altered course presented immediate logistical challenges. The Spanish guides, Spaniards, whom the company had employed to lead them thus far, exhibited significant fear of the Native American presence beyond the river they needed to cross. They refused outright to cross the river themselves, nor would they permit their essential ox teams to be taken across. This refusal forced the company into a precarious situation. They had no choice but to divide their resources and personnel. Part of the company, along with a portion of their goods, had to proceed with the few available teams, while the remainder waited behind. The plan required the first group to travel to the new site, unload, and then return with the teams to ferry the rest of the people and supplies. Sarah noted the inherent danger in a divided situation. We were too much exposed to the Indians. Compounding the difficulty, the colonists were unable to secure protection from government troops. Instead, they had to rely on their own resources. A number of their company were sent back with the departing Spanish guides to San Fernando, presumably San Fernando de Becher y San Antonio, to seek assistance. Lacking official military support, the colonists organized a volunteer company numbering some 50 or 60 men to provide security. This volunteer force was also divided. One part guarded the teams during the ferrying process, while the rest remained to protect those waiting behind. During this period of waiting and transport, while the men engaged in activities like fishing to supplement their provisions, John Horn experienced a life-threatening incident. While fishing in the river, he came near losing his life and was rescued from drowning only through the timely aid of one of our soldiers. The process of moving everyone and their belongings across the river and onward to the final site took approximately 2 weeks. Finally, on March 16th, the remaining members of the company, including the Horn family, arrived at the designated location around 4 hours in the afternoon. Recognizing the need for defense against potential attack, the men selected a site for their initial encampment, strategically located in the midst of a thicket. They cut away the dense brush in the center to create a clearing and immediately began erecting their tents. The day had been relatively pleasant, marked by a little brisk wind, but conditions deteriorated rapidly as evening approached. Clouds gathered, and before the tents were fully set up, a moderate rain began, which soon intensified into a torrent. Darkness fell quickly before sunset, making work difficult. The situation became dire as a severe storm unleashed thunder and lightning with the dreadful wind and rain, described by Sarah as altogether awful. John Horn struggled intensely to keep their frail habitation erect. The tent was blown down once or twice, requiring strenuous effort to re-establish it each time. Sarah recounted standing nearly the whole of that fearful night ankle, deep in water, holding bedclothes over her young children to shield them as much as possible from the raging elements. Near this initial campsite, the colonists began constructing more permanent dwellings, log cabins. Their construction method prioritized security. Approximately 40 men worked together clearing brush from the center of a large, dense thicket. They then piled the cut brush around the perimeter of the cleared space, forming a formidable, almost impassable hedge. This fortified enclosure surrounded an area large enough to contain their cabins, serving as a crucial precaution to guard them against the Indians. Close to this protected compound, each man selected a plot of ground for cultivation. However, hopes for agricultural success quickly faded. The soil proved largely infertile, yielding little or nothing without extensive irrigation. Despite incessant labor, they achieved only a meager harvest due to poor soil salinity in many areas, and the need to fetch potable water from half a mile away. This reality stood in stark contrast to the earlier promises that the soil would easily repay the husbandmen with 2 rich crops in the year. Sarah lamented that after all their toil, they could not even get one that deserved the name. Throughout their time at this settlement, the volunteer soldiers maintained constant guard duty, day and night. Life was marked by scarcity and extremely high costs for basic necessities like corn and coffee obtained from distant San Fernando, adding to their burdens. Sugar, however, was noted as being available by the barrel in San Fernando for 6.25 cents per pound, suggesting transport and availability heavily influenced prices. The colonists remained at this location for nearly a full year, from their arrival on March 16, 1835, until March 8 of the following year, 1836. The period from April to September was marked by intense heat, forcing residents to remain indoors between noon and 3:00 p.m. daily. Adding to the discomfort, evenings brought swarms of distressing flies and mosquitoes. Life in the isolated settlement was punctuated by alarms that highlighted their vulnerability. On one occasion, the entire colony was thrown into fear over the fate of a young boy about 7 years old. The boy was responsible for tending a small herd of goats. While his older brother briefly returned to the settlement for breakfast, the younger boy disappeared. For 2 successive days and nights, the soldiers and every available person searched frantically. The community's large bell was taken out, hung on a tree, and rung continuously. The prevailing fear was that the child had fallen into the hands of the Indians. The boy's mother was described as frantic with grief. Despite exhaustive searching, no trace was found. Then, after being lost for 2 full days and nights, the little creature fortunately stumbled upon a path that led him back home. The relief was general, but the joy experienced by his almost distracted parents, especially his mother, was deemed beyond description. These accumulated hardships, the poor land, the constant threat, the difficult living conditions, the sense of being misled about the location, began to take their toll. The colonists reinforced their belief that the cruel disappointment regarding the location change served primarily to benefit land speculators. They also confirmed that another key claim made during recruitment was false, the Rio Grande. They ascertained was not navigable in a way that could support commerce, nor could it be made so through artificial means. The combination of disillusionment and the ever-present danger of being murdered by savages without a moment's warning prompted some colonists to abandon the settlement. 4 families, along with a number of single young men, decided to leave. Sarah Horn indicated that her family would have likely departed with this group, except that both she and her eldest son John were ill at the time with ague and fever. Amidst the genuine dangers and hardships, an incident occurred that, while somewhat ludicrous in its origin, had serious consequences. A young man within the colony had apparently manifested great courage regarding potential encounters with Native Americans, boasting frequently about how he would react during an assault. He habitually kept 2 loaded guns close by, seeking to test his proclaimed bravery. A group of colonists, a number of men with the wife of one of them, devised a secret plot. They managed to unload his guns, reloading them with only powder without shot. The following morning, the young man took his guns as usual and went to a nearby creek to fish. The conspirators. 5 men disguised themselves, then revealed themselves intermittently in the bushes, pretending to hide from him. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The young man became so alarmed that instead of firing his ineffective guns, he attempted to leap across the creek. He fell into the middle of the stream, nearly ruining one of his firearms. The commotion quickly reached the main camp, causing panic, as most assumed a real attack was underway, except for the woman involved in the plot. The truth about the prank was soon revealed to the group. However, the experience had a devastating impact on the young man who was the target of the joke. Sarah observed that, from that hour, the poor young man was ruined. He never afterward seemed to be himself during the remaining time they were together at the settlement, and she later learned that he eventually went wholly beside himself. Other setbacks contributed to the colonists' difficulties. Provisions that had been left stored at the mission house. Likely, refugee back in Austin's colony during their journey were discovered to be missing when they sent for them. They were informed the supplies had been stolen, and they never recovered them. Furthermore, the harsh realities of the land itself led John Horn to reassess the value of the Promised Land grant. Considering the indifferent quality of the soil and the numerous embarrassments involved in cultivating it, he concluded that the 137 acres of bounty land were not worth the expense of having them officially surveyed, and consequently, he never located it. The colonists' anxieties were further amplified by news of a brutal attack that occurred approximately 40 miles away from their settlement. This event, described by Sarah as a scene of savage barbarity, significantly enhanced the darkness of the gloom pervading her already troubled mind. At the location, a farm was being improved by a company of 7 men. 2 of these men happened to have left for other settlements on the afternoon of the incident. A party identified as Comanche Indians approached the farmhouse and requested a sheep for their supper, a request that was granted. The following morning, the Comanches returned and asked for another sheep. This time, the request was refused. Immediately following the refusal, the Comanches commenced the work of death. Within moments, 5 men and a boy lay on the ground, presumed dead. The attackers proceeded to scalp all 6 victims, taking the scalps from the head as low down to the ears. After gathering whatever plunder they could, they departed. The next day, the 2 men who had been absent returned to the farm. Discovering the massacre, they immediately set out to seek assistance to pursue the attackers. They returned the same evening accompanied by a company of soldiers. Upon examining the scene, it was discovered that one of the men initially left for dead was still alive, albeit shockingly mangled. Though shockingly wounded and enduring indescribable suffering, the man miraculously survived. He was taken 20 miles to San Fernando, eventually recovering despite losing an arm. He later recounted the harrowing details of being scalped. He stated that the warrior who took his scalp after making the initial incision around his head actually stood upon his shoulders and forcibly tore it from him as he would skin from a slaughtered sheep. News of this horrific event, with its graphic details of Comanche brutality, served as a potent and terrifying reminder of the dangers surrounding the isolated Beals Colony settlers. The harrowing intelligence regarding the Comanche massacre, approximately 40 miles away, served as a catalyst for the remaining colonists. Sarah Horn noted that this news served to hasten us in our deliberations. The consensus formed rapidly: they would abandon the Beals settlement. Their new objective was to reach the port town of Matamoros on the Mexican coast with the ultimate aim of securing passage on a ship bound for England as soon as possible. Embarking on this journey presented its own set of formidable dangers. The route from their isolated location to any accessible harbor was acknowledged as being fraught with danger from the savage foe. The risks were deemed too great for any individual or single family to undertake the hazardous enterprise alone. Consequently, a small company was formed specifically for this departure attempt. It consisted of only 11 men in total. Notably, just 2 of these men were accompanied by their families, a Mr. Harris and Sarah's husband, John Horn. Compounding the threat from Native American groups was the volatile political and military situation unfolding in Texas at that time. General Santa Anna's forces were actively engaged in military operations across the region, described by Sarah as ravaging the country with fire and sword. Santa Anna, perceived as waging a war of extermination against the Americans, represented a danger no less a terror to us than the Indians. To minimize the risk of encountering Santa Anna's army, which was reportedly operating relatively near their position, the small departing company opted for a circuitous route deviating toward San Patricio. Their journey commenced by traversing country lacking established roads. For several days they navigated through the wilderness. The first day's travel covered approximately 8 miles before they encamped for the night. The desolate landscape and the unfamiliar cries of the wild animals deeply unsettled Sarah, resonating powerfully with her pre-existing anxieties. She reflected on being thousands of miles from the land of my birth, thwarted at every turn in their quest for a secure home, now finding themselves in a strange land, the theater of blood and carnage, causing her heart to sink almost within me. Travel was impeded by equipment failure. On the 3rd day of their journey, a wheel on one of the wagons gave way, forcing the small group to halt and undertake time-consuming repairs before they could proceed. Eventually, the company reached the Rio Nueces. They decided to stop here for several days, primarily to allow their crucial oxen time to rest and recruit their strength. Near this river, the travelers came upon a road leading toward San Patricio. Both before and after reaching this road, they could distinctly hear the discharge of firearms from Santa Anna's soldiers engaged in hunting game for sustenance. They could also hear the voices of the Mexican Army teamsters driving their supply wagons. The region around the river teemed with wildlife. The party observed plenty of buffalo and numerous wild horses. Sarah described the horses as the most beautiful creatures I ever beheld, particularly noting the interesting sights of mares with their little sprightly colts approaching the river to drink. After the restorative break, the group departed from the Rio Nueces on April 2, 1836. They traveled approximately 10 or 12 miles that day before establishing their camp for the night. The following day, April 3rd, involved routine travel. On the morning of April 4th, the company started quite early. Their specific objective for the day was to reach a large lake situated further along their route. This lake was reputed to contain an abundance of excellent fish, and it was also known as a location where some Americans had recently killed an alligator. The small company reached their objective, the large lake reputed for its fish, around 1:00 p.m. on April 4, 1836. Sarah Horn would later refer to this location simply as the fatal spot. Upon arrival, the group relaxed its vigilance, settling into midday routines. Before detailing the events that followed, Sarah provided context regarding her only female companion, Mrs. Harris. Mrs. Harris was described as being of feeble health and was caring for an infant daughter approximately 3 months old. Compounding her difficulties, Mrs. Harris was severely afflicted with broken breasts, a painful condition that made nursing difficult. Consequently, her sweet little girl was frequently in Sarah Horn's arms and care. As the group paused at the lake, the oxen were unyoked from the wagons and turned out to graze. The scene was one of relative domesticity and unguarded rest. Some of the men began cooking dinner, utilizing meat from a fine deer, likely hunted earlier. Others occupied themselves with fishing in the lake, while some attended to their firearms or engaged in reading. Mrs. Harris was situated a short distance away from the main group occupied with gathering some wild fruits. John Horn sat on the ground near Sarah and their 2 young sons, John and Joseph. He had acquired some teeth from the alligator reportedly killed near the lake earlier, and was engaged in meticulously drilling holes through them with a gimlet intending to fashion them into necklaces to please the children. The tranquility was shattered in an instant. Sarah had just finished watching Mrs. Harris's baby and was stepping up onto the front part of their wagon to retrieve a clean dress for the infant. As she did so, her gaze fell upon a large group approaching, strang-looking men mounted on mules, armed and nearly naked. Their appearance immediately triggered alarm. Terribly frightened, Sarah ran back to her husband as quickly as possible, relaying what she had seen and expressing her fear that they were Indians. John Horn looked up into her face and, attempting to downplay the threat, smiled, stating he thought there could be no danger. He then urged her to proceed with dressing the baby, which she still held naked in her arms. His words of reassurance were tragically cut short. While he was speaking, Sarah recounted the attackers came in sight and the work of death commenced. The assault was immediate and brutal. The first casualty Sarah witnessed was one of their men standing directly beside her. An arrow struck him squarely in the breast. The man managed to pull the arrow out with his own hands, but blood flowed in a stream. And he collapsed onto his face, expiring almost instantly. Chaos engulfed the small encampment as the members of their little company began falling in every direction. Reacting instinctively, Sarah flew to my husband, who was standing a short distance away. Their 2 sons were positioned, one on each side of him, holding his hands. Amidst the unfolding violence, Sarah still carried Mrs. Harris's infant in her arms. Mrs. Harris herself, described as dreadfully frightened, had sought refuge by hiding in nearby bushes. As Sarah reached her husband, she grasped the hand of her younger son Joseph. At that exact moment, the attackers were in the midst of us. They immediately seized Sarah and her children, forcibly tearing them away from John Horn. Simultaneously, one of the warriors struck John Horn violently on the back of his head with the heavy stock of a double-barreled gun. He fell forward, landing on his face on the ground. Sarah witnessed his final movements. She saw him draw his arms up under him and raise his head once from the ground, at which point he uttered a deep sigh and his life ended. There was no time permitted for grief or reaction near the body of her husband. The attackers immediately conducted Sarah and her terrified children towards one of the wagons. By this time, the assailants had located Mrs. Harris in her hiding place and brought her, presumably equally terrified, to the same spot by the wagon. There, Sarah handed Mrs. Harris back her infant daughter, Sarah's own children. John and Joseph were understandably frantic with grief and fear. In her own distracted condition, Sarah attempted to console them, doing whatever she could to offer comfort. However, the captors actively prevented this. They took every precaution to stop her, promptly tearing the little trembling creatures away from her grasp. Displaying their weapons, they communicated through menacing signs that the children would be killed if they dared to approach their mother again. Sarah estimated the number of attackers directly involved in this initial assault to be between 40 and 50 individuals. However, she noted with ominous foresight that this group represented but a small part of the whole band, a fact that would become apparent later. Having subdued the small company, the warriors turned their attention to the wagons. They began throwing the contents out onto the ground, selecting items they deemed valuable or useful. Once the plunder was gathered, arrangements were made for transporting the captives. Sarah and Mrs. Harris were placed onto mules seated behind two of the warriors. Mrs. Harris continued to hold her own baby. Sarah's two sons, John and Joseph, were placed under the charge of two other men. With the captives thus mounted and under guard, the group departed the location where, in a matter of moments, the emigrants' lives had been irrevocably shattered and their fondest earthly hopes buried. The warriors conducted their captives away from the scene of the massacre towards their main encampment. Sarah soon learned this camp was situated only about 2 miles from the location of the attack. As the group drew near, specifically when they were within about 1/4 of a mile, they were confronted by a spectacle that Sarah later struggled to describe adequately. Several hundred additional warriors, identified as companions of the initial attacking party, emerged to meet them. They were arranged in files, standing perhaps 6 or 8 abreast. Their arrival was greeted with what Sarah termed barbarous joy, expressed through extremely horrid yells and unsettling varied contortions of body and limbs. Following this intimidating reception, the captives were led directly into the camp itself. The location had been strategically chosen for concealment, established in the midst of an almost impenetrable thicket. Upon reaching this dreadful place, the prisoners were immediately struck by an overwhelming stench. Sarah reported being nearly suffocated by the odor arising from stale horse meats scattered in and around the encampment. Here, within the confines of the hidden camp, Sarah and Mrs. Harris were directed to sit on the ground, placed under guard. Almost immediately, the warriors began stripping the two women of their remaining personal effects. Their bonnets, handkerchiefs, combs, and rings were taken from them. The process extended to Sarah's young sons. Everything was taken from the children, leaving them completely naked, just as naked as they were born. Mrs. Harris's infant daughter, who had been unclothed in Sarah's arms at the moment of the attack, remained naked. Sarah recalled begging the captors even before leaving the site of the ambush to allow her to wrap the baby in a blanket, but permission was refused. The infant remained exposed. As night began to fall, the warriors partook of their meal, consisting of the offensive horse meat whose odor permeated the camp. Despite having plundered a considerable amount of the emigrants' own provisions during the attack, the captors offered absolutely nothing to eat to either the captive women or their children. Sarah explicitly noted that neither she, Mrs. Harris, nor the children were ever permitted to taste any of the food taken from their own supplies. Before the warriors settled down for the night, they bound the two women. Cords were passed around their ankles and arms, securing their limbs tightly against their sides. In this highly restrictive condition, Sarah and Mrs. Harris were placed directly upon the bare ground. A single blanket was thrown over them as cover for the night. The ensuing hours were filled with torment. Throughout that dreadful night, Sarah listened to the heart-wrenching cries of her now fatherless children. The young boys called out for their murdered father and pleaded pitifully for water to alleviate their thirst. Sarah felt her agonized heart seemed ready to burst. Adding to her physical and emotional suffering, she was relentlessly attacked by mosquitoes described as being of enormous size. Bound completely, she possessed not a single limb with which to defend myself. The combination of grief, fear for her children, physical discomfort, and helplessness made the night an ordeal almost beyond description, a painfully memorable experience whose full horror she felt defied the power of language. The ordeal continued until near daylight. Mrs. Harris's infant, who had lain relatively quiet through the night, began to cry likely from cold and hunger. The baby had been sustained thus far on food prepared by hand, likely pap or similar soft food which Sarah had administered with maternal care. However, since the morning before the attack, there had been no opportunity to prepare anything for the infant. As soon as the captives were permitted to rise from the ground, Sarah approached the warriors and asked for some flour, hoping to make something for the baby to eat. The response she received was chilling. One of the warriors replied affirmatively, stating, "Yes, it shall have something to eat." This verbal agreement was accompanied by a smile. Then a tall, muscular Indian approached Sarah. He took hold of the crying infant. In a horrifying display of brutality, he swung the baby by its arms, threw it upwards as high as he could, and then deliberately let it fall upon the hard ground at his feet. This action was repeated 2 more times. After the third impact, the infant's sufferings were at an end. It is important to note, as Sarah pointed out for context, that neither the captive women nor the children had consumed any food since their early breakfast on the morning of April the 4th, the day before their capture. Despite the prolonged lack of sustenance, Sarah herself felt no hunger. Her grief and shock were so profound that she felt her heart appeared swollen to an unnatural size within me, and it seemed unlikely she would ever want food again. The distressed moanings of her own children begging for bread and water, however, affected her deeply. She expressed that had it been possible, she would have willingly torn the flesh from her own bones to appease their hunger. Furthermore, she felt she could have freely offered the very blood from her heart, the substance prolonging her own miserable existence, if it could have quenched their desperate thirst. Following the brutal killing of the infant, the warriors prepared to move the camp. The mules were saddled for departure. In a final act of desecration, a string was tied around the neck of the dead baby, and its small body was callously hung from the horn of one of the saddles. The warriors then ordered Sarah Horn to mount this particular mule, evidently mistaking her for the infant's mother. Sarah refused this command. They subsequently ordered Mrs. Harris, the actual mother, to mount the mule, but she also refused. Faced with this defiance, the warriors brandished their lances, threatening to kill both women if they did not comply. Still, both Sarah and Mrs. Harris held firm in their refusal. The standoff was broken when one of the warriors who possessed some knowledge of Spanish approached the mule unceremoniously, threw the infant's corpse from the saddle horn, and then commanded the women to get onto the mule. At this point, having been spared the horror of riding with the dead child, they complied. Sarah's younger son Joseph was crying so incessantly that even the warriors, despite their demonstrated cruelty, found it seemingly impossible to keep him from his mother. They made the concession of placing the distressed child behind Sarah on the mule she rode. Her older son John was placed behind another warrior on a different mount. The grim procession set off. They had traveled only a short distance, estimated by Sarah at around 300 or 400 yards from the camp where the baby was killed, when they encountered a shocking sight. Standing before them, surrounded by a party of warriors, were Mr. Harris and the young German man who had been part of their original departing group. Both Sarah and Mrs. Harris had presumed that all the men in their company, aside from their captors, had been killed during the initial attack the previous day. Seeing these 2 men alive, therefore, brought immense surprise. It quickly became apparent, however, that this was not an act of mercy. Both Mr. Harris and the German man had been wounded during the attack and likely left for dead on the ground. Warriors had subsequently found them, brought them into the camp, and deliberately deferred killing them until they could inflict further psychological torture upon the captive women by forcing them to witness the men's demise. As Sarah and Mrs. Harris rode up, they saw Mr. Harris had a handkerchief bound around his head, likely covering a wound. He looked towards his wife and Sarah with what Sarah described as an agonizing look, but he remained silent, uttering not a word. As soon as the entire company came to a halt, the warriors made it explicitly clear that the women must watch the proceedings. They then executed both Mr. Harris and the young German man, shooting them dead upon the spot. Immediately after this dreadful scene had been completed, the signal was given to move, and the company commenced our march once again. They had proceeded only a short distance further when the mule Sarah and young Joseph were riding suddenly took fright. It bolted and ran uncontrollably, eventually throwing both mother and child onto the ground. The mule continued running until it managed to disengage itself completely from its saddle. Sarah recounted feeling that a merciful providence preserved her from serious harm in the fall, but her son Joseph was not as fortunate, receiving a significant bruise on one of his shoulders. Despite the fall and the obvious distress, the warriors showed no sympathy. Instead, they commanded Sarah to retrieve the heavy saddle and then catch the spooked mule herself to replace the saddle upon its back. She struggled under the weight of the saddle and made fruitless efforts to catch the animal, pursuing it in vain. As she neared the point of fainting beneath my load, one of the warriors finally intervened. He approached with a rope and successfully caught the mule for her. Recognizing that Sarah likely did not know how to properly place and secure the saddle, he performed that task for her as well. Once remounted, the journey continued across the open prairie for the remainder of the day. During this travel, the warriors occupied themselves by hunting and catching wild horses, presumably to supplement their food supply. Before nightfall, the company halted and established their camp for the night within the protective cover of another thicket. Shortly after they had settled into this new campsite, a number of warriors arrived, bringing with them the rest of the items plundered from the emigrants' camp at the lake where the attack occurred. Among these items was the very food, the deer meat and other provisions, that the small company had been in the process of cooking for their dinner when the assault began. The warriors proceeded to devour this food before our eyes, pointedly refusing to permit either the captive women or Sarah's children to have even a morsel. Sarah took the opportunity when the men returned to camp to inquire about what they had done with the body of Mrs. Harris's infant. The responses were conflicting and disturbingly callous. One warrior replied with a laugh that he had hung the body on a tree. Another contradicted him, claiming they had tied a stone to the body and sunk it in water. Throughout this time, Sarah's dear babes John and Joseph were constantly crying for bread and drink. Sarah could not obtain permission to give them anything, nor could the inhuman wretches, as she called them, be persuaded to offer the children sustenance themselves. Late in the evening, the captors finally brought Sarah a small quantity of water. The amount was so minimal that despite being nearly overcome with thirst herself, she gave the entire portion to her famishing babes, who drank it instantly. As night fell, the women were bound again in the usual manner and laid upon the bare ground. Mrs. Harris, Sarah noted, suffered extreme pain from her injured breasts. Before their capture, both her husband and Sarah had been able to provide some care and attention for her condition. Now, with her husband dead and Sarah herself bound and powerless, assistance was impossible. Sarah reflected on her own emotional state during these initial days of captivity. She found it strange that throughout the entire dreadful tragedy up to this point, she had been unable to shed a single tear. It felt as though her heart beat only to sustain a level of anguish too great for utterance by groans or tears. She believed that only the special interposition of an invisible almighty power prevented the sheer agony of my soul from causing her death, thus becoming the angel of my deliverance. However, during this second night of captivity, as she lay bound and helpless, pondering the grim fate of her husband, the precarious situation of her children, and her own hopeless condition, as she felt the crushing weight of disappointment obliterating her hopes, she reached a breaking point. Feeling herself sinking, if possible still deeper in despair, the emotional dam finally broke. A torrent of tears erupted, providing a measure of relief. Though bound hand and foot, unable even to wipe the scalding drops from her face, the release stemmed from the swelling fountains of her heart, the tears pouring onto the ground where she lay. Sarah later realized she should have mentioned earlier that the warriors, upon their return from the initial attack site, had not only plundered goods, but had also stripped the clothing from the bodies of the slain emigrants and taken their scalps. These gruesome trophies had been subsequently prepared according to their customs, likely painted and stretched taut within hoops for display or use in ceremonies. The morning after their first harrowing night in the second camp, the warriors visited Sarah and Mrs. Harris early. They untied the captives' limbs, permitting them to rise, which they did, albeit with some difficulty, due to the stiffness and discomfort from being bound. For some time before being untied, the women had heard the sounds of a fife and drum, but lying bound on the ground, they could not discern the cause. Upon rising, the reason became chillingly clear. In the center of the encampment stood a large tree. Its bark had been stripped off for some distance up the trunk. Upon this exposed wood, the warriors had painted crude figures. One figure depicted Sarah herself, recognizably holding Mrs. Harris's baby in her arms. Another figure represented Mrs. Harris, shown holding the hand of each of Sarah's sons who stood flanking her. These paintings revealed the warriors' persistent confusion regarding the maternal relationships. They evidently believed Mrs. Harris's infant belonged to Sarah, and that Sarah's 2 sons belonged to Mrs. Harris. Sarah noted that the representations, though crude, strikingly designated their specific bonnets and dresses. Around this painted tree, the male warriors formed a circle. Each man held a stick. Some sticks had a string tied to the end, forming a whip-like implement from which was fastened one of the scalps taken from the slain emigrants. Next to a man holding a scalp-adorned stick stood another man holding only a plain stick, and this alternating pattern continued around the entire circle. Sarah and Mrs. Harris were then positioned within this circle along with the warriors, and sticks were placed into their hands, compelling their participation. Once the formation was complete, the warriors commenced their music and dancing. This ritualistic activity continued for some time. Then, at a signal given by the chief, the general dancing ceased. Those holding the scalps lowered them, while those holding the plain sticks proceeded to beat upon the scalps. Sarah and Mrs. Harris were forced to join in this action. Reflecting on the moment, Sarah could only invite the reader to judge, if possible, the kind of feeling such compelled participation evoked. This entire ceremony, involving dancing and the ritualistic beating of the scalps, continued at short intervals for approximately 2 hours. The company remained at this encampment for the rest of the day. During this time, a number of the warriors went out in search of the emigrants' oxen that had scattered during the attack. They eventually returned, having located and brought back only 2 of the original 6 animals. While the men were occupied with this task, Sarah and Mrs. Harris were put to work under the command of their captors. Their task was to cut and alter their own clothing to better suit the convenience of the savages. Their dresses were modified, likely opened or cut, so the warriors could wear them. Poignantly, among the garments subjected to this forced alteration were some articles of clothing that had once belonged to Sarah's own deceased mother, items she had preserved as precious mementos. That evening marked the first time since their capture that the captives were permitted to taste meat. The only sustenance they had managed to obtain previously since the breakfast on the morning of their capture 3 days prior consisted of the occasional small blackberry gathered from bushes along the way. By this time, however, intense hunger had overcome their revulsion, making them willing to partake of the horse meat that the warriors had killed the previous day. Sarah's children, however, initially refused the unfamiliar food. Only after seeing their mother consume some of it could they be induced to taste it themselves. Also that evening, Sarah sought and received permission to attend to Mrs. Harris's severely afflicted breasts. Upon examination, she found they had broken and were in a wretched condition, doing the best she could with available resources. Sarah dressed the wounds using the leaves of the prickly pear cactus. She observed that soon after this treatment, the condition began to show signs of mending. When night fell, they were once again bound as usual and laid upon the ground. The children's cries for their father and for bread continued to distress Sarah. Her attempts to soothe them with promises of finding bread tomorrow eventually led only to their despairing reply that tomorrow never comes here. The following day, the company resumed its travels, following the same general order as before, with one significant change for Sarah. Her younger son Joseph was taken from her and placed behind one of the warrior boys, whose name Sarah recalled as Stopus. This separation added another layer to the young child's suffering. Joseph was still experiencing pain from the bruised shoulder sustained during his fall from the mule 2 days prior. Additionally, traveling completely naked, his skin was becoming severely sunburned, sometimes burned to a blister. Compounding his misery, the boy Stowe behind whom he rode was reportedly so cross that he would not permit Joseph to hold on to him for stability. Sarah, forced to ride separately, was forbidden from doing anything to help her son, not even allowed to speak a consoling word to him. She could only watch as the little sufferer, enduring his multiple afflictions, would seize fleeting opportunities to steal a glance at his almost distracted mother and attempt to communicate his woes. This pattern of suppressed communication continued. Every morning and evening, the children would watch for any chance to voice their complaints to their mother. Their simple, artless entreaties for a morsel of bread were constant, yet met with unrelenting indifference from their captors. Pleas Sarah felt were enough to melt any heart but that of a savage. On one particular day during this phase of the journey, the company stopped traveling early in the afternoon. The warriors proceeded to kill the 2 captured oxen that belonged to the emigrants. Sarah and Mrs. Harris were immediately tasked with preparing a place to cook the meat. Sarah described their method. A hole was dug in the ground large enough to contain a fire. Sticks were then driven into the ground around the margin of the hole, angled so their tops met, and could be fastened together above the pit. The meat was placed on this framework of sticks, allowing the fire burning in the hole beneath to cook it quite effectively. During this labor, Mrs. Harris faced significant difficulties. In addition to the ongoing pain from her broken breasts, her ability to work was hampered by the fact that she was left-handed. The warriors, Sarah observed, would by no means suffer a poor broken-hearted captive to work with her left hand in the place of the right. Since Mrs. Harris could accomplish little with her right hand, she would inevitably resort to using her left during her painful exertions. Whenever she did so, the warriors would fall upon her and beat her most unmercifully. Sarah identified one individual who was a particularly relentless tormentor of Mrs. Harris. This was a young Native American woman described as being very small in her person and estimated by Sarah to be no more than 20 years old. She belonged to the specific group that claimed Mrs. Harris as their prisoner. Despite her youth and size, Sarah considered her perhaps the most depraved individual she had encountered, stating, "Of all the depraved beings I have seen, I think she excelled." This young woman relentlessly tormented Mrs. Harris day and night. Sarah often saw her choke Mrs. Harris until she collapsed, after which the woman's cruel master would jump on and stomp her with potentially lethal force. In navigating the complex and dangerous interactions with their captors, Sarah possessed a significant advantage: her ability to speak Spanish. Within the warrior band, there were 2 individuals who had been held as prisoners among Spaniards in their youth and had consequently learned the language. This linguistic connection provided Sarah with a means of communication. However limited, Mrs. Harris unfortunately spoke only a few words of Spanish. This lack of language ability became a fruitful source of affliction for her. The warriors apparently lacked the patience to communicate with her through interpreters, presumably Sarah or the Spanish-speaking warriors. As a result, blows instead of words were frequently plentifully dealt out to her as the primary means of conveying commands or displeasure. Comparing their experiences, Sarah concluded that if not for the specific anguish she endured concerning her children, Mrs. Harris's overall sufferings were greater than her own. Eventually, the task of preparing the cooking site was completed. After the beef from their own oxen was cooked, the captives were permitted to partake of some of it. This marked only the second time since their capture that either the women or Sarah's children had tasted meat, the first being the horse meat. They were still without salt at this point, though Sarah noted they would acquire some later. The journey continued without any deviation from the established routine of hardship and vigilance until the company reached a stream of water. Based on her understanding of the geography, Sarah estimated their location to be approximately 25 or 30 miles from Matamoros, described as a seaport town on the Spanish coast, referring to the Mexican coast of the Gulf. Here by the stream, the group encamped. Shortly after their arrival, some of the warriors who were traveling in the front of the column crossed the stream. As Sarah rode up towards the bank, she observed several individuals she identified as Americans positioned on the opposite side. She witnessed the warriors approaching these men. One of the Americans stretched out his hands in a defensive or warning gesture and clearly shouted, "Stand back! Stand back! It is best for you to stand back." Due to the density of the trees lining the stream bank, the trees stood so thick together, Sarah could not visually ascertain what immediately followed this exchange. However, the sharp report of guns echoed through the trees, conveying a message she understood all too well. The work of death had commenced across the water. Within a few short minutes, as she later reflected, the hopes and fears of those men were irrevocably hushed into the silence of death. Sometime later, some of the warriors returned from the other side of the stream. They brought with them a gruesome object, the arm of a man. Judging from its appearance, described as black and significantly reduced in size, it seemed to have belonged to a body that had been dead for a considerable time. The warriors identified it perhaps mockingly or through misidentification as belonging to a Tino American. Around this same time, another group of warriors returned to the encampment, bringing with them a new captive. This prisoner was described as a Spanish gentleman. He appeared to be a very small, delicate-looking man. He was brought into the camp riding his own horse, but had been stripped of nearly all his clothing, left with just enough fabric to screen his nakedness. The warriors ordered him to be seated on the ground. With an imploring look, the man tremblingly obeyed. Immediately, his captors began the interrogation, feigning friendship with satanic hypocrisy to extract information about his home family and the surrounding country. The captain of the warrior band into whose hands the Horn party had fallen then ordered the Spaniard's clothes to be returned to him. The captain proceeded to ask the prisoner if he knew the two captive women, Mrs. Harris and Sarah. The Spaniard replied that he did not know them personally, but recognized them as being Americans. Confirming this, the chief informed the Spaniard that the women were indeed Americans, and elaborated on his group's political stance. They considered themselves friends to the Spaniard, but were enemies of the Americans. He stated plainly that they had killed the American men accompanying the women, but added, perhaps as a temporary reassurance or a statement of policy, that they did not intend to kill the female captives until they should see Santa Anna. The interrogation continued. The warriors pressed the Spaniard for all the news of the country, which Sarah believed he provided as far as he was able. They then inquired if he had a room in his house suitable for locking up the two women, expressing a desire for him to keep them a while, until the warriors could go out and search for more Americans. The Spaniard replied that his house was small and lacked such a facility. Next, they asked if he could supply them with some bread. He answered that he could not provide bread either. Having extracted the desired information, the warriors decided to move the entire encampment towards the Spaniard's home. They broke camp and started out, but it seemed the distance was greater than initially supposed. They halted their progress slightly short of the destination and made camp for the night. Throughout this, the poor little Spaniard pleaded with his captors to allow him to go home to his wife and children. His pleas were denied. As Sarah observed grimly, his fate was sealed. He had already seen the cherished, dear objects of his deep and keen solicitude for the last time that night. Later that night, as the Spanish prisoner lay down presumably to sleep, the warriors killed him, shooting him with an arrow that sent his anxious soul to another world. Sarah confessed that the earlier inquiry about locking the women in the Spaniard's house had momentarily sparked a gleam of hope within her. The thought flashed across her mind that such confinement might paradoxically increase their chances of rescue or escape. However, witnessing the man's subsequent murder swiftly extinguished this fragile hope. The illusion vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It was evident that the warriors had thoroughly plundered the Americans killed at the stream encounter earlier that day. They now possessed the victims' clothes, horses, and associated gear. Based on what she could gather, Sarah judged that these unfortunate men were likely a fragment of some army, possibly soldiers or volunteers who had fled before the merciless Santa Anna. She estimated their number might have been 5 or more, but she could not ascertain the exact figure. Early the next morning, the warrior band, along with their captives, resumed their journey and soon reached the residence of the murdered Spanish prisoner. Sarah described it as a pleasant little dwelling. Its location was such that she suspected the man's wife likely remained unaware of their approach until the warriors, the ministers of death, had completely surrounded the house. The warriors then rushed inside. From her vantage point, Sarah witnessed the fatal arrow being dispatched on its commission to take her life. She saw the woman fall and then watched as the warriors dragged her beautiful form out through the doorway, reeking in blood. The violence did not end there. The warriors then re-entered the house and proceeded to kill the woman's 2 young children, stilling their cries in the silence of death. Based on appearance, the eldest child seemed to be between 2 and 3 years old, while the other was still a nursing infant. Sarah's observations suggested this family had enjoyed a degree of prosperity appearing to be above the ordinary class. Both the man and his wife were gentilly dressed. Inside the house, evidence indicated the wife had been engaged in domestic activity just before the attack. She appeared to have been making shirts for her husband from very fine linen. 2 shirts were completed, and she was apparently working on a third. A large quantity of similar high-quality linen fabric was also found within the house. After thoroughly plundering the premises of everything that could turn to their advantage, the warriors destroyed what they could not easily carry away. Having completed their work of killing, looting, and destruction, they immediately departed the scene. Almost immediately after leaving the Spaniards' home, the warriors initiated a desperate rush along the margin of the nearby creek. Initially, Sarah was unsure of their objective, at a loss to conjecture. However, she soon learned the dreadful secret. It appeared the murdered Spanish prisoner during his interrogation had informed the warriors about the presence of 3 additional refugees hiding nearby, 2 Spaniards and 1 American. Now the warriors were racing to locate these individuals, driven by the desire to secure any plunder they might possess. They quickly located the hidden refugees. One of them, an American, was found asleep inside a rudely constructed cabin. The other 2, the Spaniards, were discovered fishing in the creek. Upon the warriors' arrival, the sleeping man awoke startled and tried to flee but was quickly shot dead. The 2 Spaniards fishing nearby were shot down as they stood on the bank. As soon as they had concluded this further work of blood, the warriors turned out their mules to graze. They proceeded to spend the greatest part of the day at this location by the creek near the bodies of their most recent victims. During this extended stop, Sarah and Mrs. Harris were again put to labor. They were employed in sewing the fine linen fabric taken from the murdered Spaniard's house into sheets intended for the warriors to wrap themselves in. They were also tasked with altering the dresses belonging to the slain Spanish woman so that the warriors could wear them. While the women mournfully sewed garments taken from the dead, the warriors amused themselves by shooting arrows into the corpses of the men just slain. They forced the captives to watch amidst horrid yells of triumph and curses against the Americans, adding another layer to their torment. Forced to witness the final grotesque desecration of the dead while working on items looted from victims, Sarah Horn and Mrs. Harris endured the latest horror in stunned silence. The relentless cascade of violence and loss since the lakeside attack plunged them deeper into despair. Yet this marked only a fraction of Sarah Horn's harrowing captivity. Her journey through further brutality, incredible resilience, and the story of her eventual fate remains to be told.